What's up, guys? Welcome to the Mana Fix, where we cover Commander deck techs across various archetypes, budgets, and themes. Today we're talking about a brand new commander from Theros Beyond Death. Dalakos, Crafter of Wonders, is a 2/4 Merfolk Artificer that costs 1 blue-red. You can tap him to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool, but that mana can only be used to cast artifacts or activate abilities of artifacts. He also gives equipped creatures you control flying and haste. Now clearly this creature is meant to be built around equipment. I know that the Voltron strategy is nothing new and may even be a bit stale, but I couldn't help but feel like this card might bring a bit more life to that archetype. For starters, the commander is in Izzet colors, which is not something we've had with Voltron before. I feel like building a Voltron deck that's restricted to these 2 colors might make the strategy a bit more interesting. The other thing that excited me about this commander is how powerful his abilities seem to be. Simply equipping him with even the cheapest equipment automatically gives him flying, one of the best forms of evasion in the game, and haste. What more could you ask for as a Voltron player? He's also able to produce a good amount of mana to help cast your equipment and pay the equip costs, so he can enable other creatures you control to give a beatdown in combat. Now obviously the goal of this deck is going to be to load up our commander with all different kinds of equipment to protect him and beef him up so that we can kill our opponents with commander damage. As with any deck like this, it's a good idea to run loads of equipment. We'll start with the equipment cards that are going to help our commander deal more damage. There are 22 cards like this in the deck, which works out to 1 in every 4.5 cards that we draw. Sword of Feast and Famine, Sword of Sinew and Steel, and Sword of War and Peace all give our commander +2/+2 and have abilities that trigger when he deals damage. Sword of Feast and Famine is one of the best equipment cards out there, if not the best. When our commander deals damage to an opponent while it's equipped, that opponent will have to discard a card while we are able to untap all lands we control. Sword of Sinew and Steel allows us to remove a planeswalker and an artifact. And then Sword of War and Peace deals damage to that player equal to the number of cards in their hand. We also gain some life, but we're mainly running it for the additional damage it deals. Blackblade Reforged gives our commander +1/+1 for each land we control. This is going to help us get lethal damage very quickly, particularly in the late game. Bloodforged Battle Axe is also great for helping us boost our commander damage. It costs 1 to get out and 2 to equip and gives our commander +2/+0. But the really special thing about this card is that it creates a copy of itself whenever the creature it's equipped to deals damage. And this triggers for each copy that's equipped. So if we have 2 Bloodforged Battle Axes on Dalakos when we deal damage, we're going to create 2 more copies of it. This is one of those effects that can snowball very quickly if it's left unchecked. Conqueror's Flail gives our commander +1/+1 for each color among permanents we control, so it'll pretty much always give +2/+2. In addition to this though, it prevents our opponents from casting spells during our turn, so it protects us against counterspells and interruptions during combat. Hammer of Nazan is a staple of Voltron equipment decks nowadays. Casting this with our commander out will immediately give him +2 power and make him indestructible. After we have it out, we can immediately equip all of the equipment that we cast, adding speed and efficiency to our strategy. Another equipment deck staple is Umezawa's Jitta. This piece of equipment can beef up our commander or get rid of 1 or more pesky creatures our opponents control. Masterwork of Ingenuity is another great equipment card in this deck. It can copy any equipment we control for only 1 mana, so it's extremely flexible. 21 commander damage can be tough to reach, and one of the best things to help get you there is Double Strike. Embercleave and Fire Shrieker both give our commander Double Strike. Embercleave is an awesome card in this deck. We'll often be casting this card for 4 or 5 mana as opposed to the base 6, due to the cost reduction equal to the number of attacking creatures we control. It also immediately equips to our commander when we cast it, and in addition to giving Double Strike, also adds +1/+1 and Trample. So if one of our opponents happens to have flyers they can use to block, this card will help us get through. Another great effect to have in this deck is being able to equip our commander the turn it comes out. Shuko, Inventor's Goggles, and Hero's Blade can all do this. Shuko has an equip cost of 0, so our commander comes in on turn 3 as a 3/4 with flying and haste. Inventor's Goggles gives +1/+2 and automatically equips when an artificer enters the battlefield. Since our commander is an artificer, with this equipment card on the battlefield, our commander becomes a 3/6 with flying and haste. Hero's Blade is the best of the 3. This one automatically equips to a legendary creature when it enters the battlefield and gives +3/+2, so our commander becomes a 5/6 with flying and haste the turn it comes out. Now obviously this strategy relies heavily on our commander. Because of that, we need to have ways to help protect him. There are 10 cards in the deck that'll help us out with that, which is around 1 in 10 cards in our deck. Champion's Helm and Mask of Avacyn both give our commander hexproof and a slight boost to his base power and toughness. Lightning Greaves and Whisper Silk Cloak both give our commander Shroud. Shroud is a bit worse since we won't be able to equip anything to our commander when he has Shroud. Still, the protection it offers Dalakos is very good. Lightning Greaves is excellent because of the cheap casting cost and 0 equip cost. Whisper Silk Cloak also gives our commander unblockable in addition to Shroud to help ensure that he gets through when he attacks. We're also running a couple counter spells to help protect our strategy. Mana Drain is one of the best counter spells out there as it counters any spell for just 2 mana and also captures the CMC of the countered spell as colorless mana for your next turn. As we all know, however, Mana Drain is a very expensive card and counterspell is still great if you don't already have a Mana Drain. Another great counterspell for this deck is Muddle the Mixture. It can only counter instants and sorceries, but that's mainly what we'll want to counter anyways because that's what our opponents will be trying to use to get rid of our commander. Muddle the Mixture can also be transmuted to search for a card with CMC 2 from our library. There are several 2 CMC cards in the deck that we might want to tutor for, such as Conqueror's Flail or Umezawa's Jitta, so having this option on a counterspell is great. Since we're on the topic of tutors, there are 2 other tutor cards in the deck in addition to Muddle the Mixture. The first is Fabricate, which can find any artifact in our deck for 3 mana. The other is Whir of Invention. For this one, we pay X generic and 3 blue to search our library for an artifact with CMC X or less. It also has Improvise, which makes it significantly easier to cast, and will be able to search for any artifact in the deck. Now, as with any deck, we need to have ramp cards to try and get ahead in the mana department. This deck has 18 ramp cards, which is going to be 1 in every 5 or 6 cards that we draw. The first 5 in this category ramp us by untapping our commander. Apheto Alchemist costs 2 to get out, and his tap ability allows us to untap an artifact or creature. This will mostly be used to untap Dalakos, but it can also be used to untap a Soul Ring or something similar. Magerite Stone also costs 2 and can untap our commander, but we have to pay 1 mana to activate the ability, so that interaction will only end up netting us 1 mana. Thousand Year Elixir is essentially the same, but it also gives our commander and any other creature with an activated ability haste. So getting this card out on turn 3 and then playing Dalakos on turn 4 is a great line of play. Next up, Second Wind is actually an aura that we can enchant Dalakos with. The second ability on this card is the reason we're running it. We can tap it to untap Dalakos, allowing him to attack or add 2 additional mana to cast something else. With Pemin's aura, we can pay 1 blue mana to untap our commander. This aura is incredibly useful in other ways as well. We can also pay 1 blue to protect our commander from a spell, or pay 1 generic mana to give our commander +1/-1 until end of turn. It's worth noting that that last ability can be activated multiple times, so if we have enough mana, we can really pump up Dalakos' power with this aura. Now it's true that all of these cards can untap our commander, but they also interact well with this next card, which is the first all-star of the deck. Metalworker costs 3 generic mana for a 1/2 artifact creature. Its tap ability says reveal any number of artifact cards in your hand. Add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool for each card revealed this way. 43 of our 99 cards are artifacts. Generally speaking, this means that at any given time, almost half of the cards in our hand will be artifacts. Metalworker is often able to produce 4 or more colorless mana upon activating his ability, which is excellent value for a 3 CMC creature. As I stated before, he also works incredibly well with the untap effects previously mentioned, which will allow us to double or nearly double Metalworker's mana output. Moving on to the more traditional style of mana ramp, we're of course going to run Soul Ring, and Wayfarer's Bauble is also a good option for artifact decks. Another staple in artifact decks is Mox Opal, which will be very easy to get online as we only need to have 2 other artifacts on the battlefield, and nearly half of our deck is made up of those. We have 2 creatures that have abilities similar to our commanders. Renowned Weaponsmith and Vidalcan Engineer both have the ability to tap to add 2 mana that can only be spent on artifacts or abilities of artifacts. The restriction of only being able to use this mana on artifacts is very minor, for it being a 2 CMC mana dork that taps for 2. Next up is actually an equipment card that ramps. Sword of the Animist costs 2 to get out and 2 to equip. It gives our commander +1/+1 and a triggered ability that essentially rampant growths whenever the equipped creature deals damage. Dowsing Dagger gives Dalakos +2/+1, but what makes the card really good is what happens when our commander deals damage to an opponent while it's equipped. When this happens, the dagger transforms into Lost Veil, which is a land that taps for 3 mana of any one color. We also run several cards that reduce the cost of artifact spells we cast. Cloud Key is a 3 CMC artifact that will reduce our artifact spells by 1 generic mana. Ethereum Sculptor, Foundry Inspector, and Herald of Kozilek are all creatures that do the same. These effects can oftentimes be better than playing mana rocks because as opposed to just ramping us by 1 mana, it reduces the cost of spells we cast. So as long as we're casting more than one spell in a turn, these cards are effectively producing more mana than, say, an Arcane Signet would. Also, the effects stack, so having more than one of these on the battlefield at once is extremely beneficial to us. Now that brings me to the last ramp card in the deck, and once again, this card is an all-star. Urza, Lord High Artificer, costs 2 blue and 2 other for a 1/4 human artificer. When he enters the battlefield, we create a 0/0 artifact creature token that gets +1/+1 for each artifact we control. Now this ability is nice and the construct will most likely be pretty big, but that's only the beginning with this card. The second ability is really where the money is. We can tap an untapped artifact we control to add 1 blue mana to our mana pool. Essentially, Urza immediately turns all of our equipment cards and other artifact cards we control into mock sapphires. So if we have, say, 5 equipment cards on the battlefield at that point in time, we've just ramped ourselves by 5 mana. Now believe it or not, this isn't even where this card ends. Urza also has an ability where you can pay 5 generic mana to shuffle your library, then reveal the top card of your library and play it for free until end of turn. So if we don't have other stuff to spend our mana on, we can activate this ability for free cards. But mainly, Urza's here for the mana he produces. Now with all that mana, we need to have cards to cast with it. That's where card advantage comes into play. In this deck, we have 12 cards that provide us with card advantage. That works out to be about 1 in 8 cards that we'll draw. First off, we have a couple equipment cards in this category. Mask of Memory costs 2 to get out and 1 to equip. Whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage, we draw 2 cards and discard a card. Next up is Avarice Amulet. When this equipment is equipped, it'll draw us an extra card at the beginning of the turn. It also gives the equipped creature +2/+0. Another great thing with this card is it gives the equipped creature Vigilance. This is especially good with our commander because we can attack with him and then tap him afterwards to use the 2 mana to cast something. We do have to give it up to an opponent if the equipped creature dies, but the hope is that we're protecting that creature enough that that won't happen. Sword of Fire and Ice will draw us a card when the equipped creature deals damage and will also allow us to deal 2 damage to any target. Bag of Holding is a 1 mana artifact. We can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, then discard a card. Now admittedly, this ability on its own is not card advantage. However, its second ability is. Whenever we discard a card with Bag of Holding on the battlefield, the card is exiled. With its second ability, we can pay 4 and sacrifice it to return all cards that were exiled with it to our hand. If this card sticks around for a while, in the late game it's going to fill our hand up very nicely. Next up is Padim, Console of Innovation. At our upkeep, Padim will draw us a card as long as we control the artifact with the highest CMC or tied for the highest CMC. This is an artifact deck, so it won't be often that we fail to meet this requirement. Padim also gives our artifacts hexproof, which adds an extra layer of protection to our strategy. Ugin the Ineffable is another great card in this deck, and for a number of reasons. The first reason is he reduces the cost of colorless spells by 2. This discount on artifacts will allow us to empty our hand very quickly. Ugin's +1 ability manifests the top card of our library as a 2/2 creature. If this manifestation leaves the battlefield in any way, that card goes to our hand, so he also creates card advantage. Ugin can even remove threats with his -3 ability, so he really does it all for us. Now we do have a lot of situational card draw in this deck, so to balance that out, it's important to also include some reliable staples. Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study are just that. These 2 cards are going to punish our opponents for casting spells big time, and they're almost guaranteed to draw us some cards. Even better than these, however, are the next 2 cards. Jwara, Weatherlight Captain, and Vidalcan Archmage essentially work in the exact same way. Both are 4 CMC creatures whose triggered abilities allow us to draw a card whenever we cast an artifact. Having this effect is very powerful because now nearly every spell that we cast with one of these on the battlefield is going to replace itself, so you're much less likely to run out of things to play. Now let's finish this category off with another All-Star and probably the best card in the deck. All-Star number 3 is Mystic Forge. This is a 4 CMC artifact that allows us to look at the top card of our library at any time. We can cast the top card of our library if it's an artifact card. If we get stuck with a non-artifact card on top of our library, we can tap Mystic Forge and pay 1 life to exile the top card of our library. This is one of those cards that propels you like a jet engine to victory. Like I stated earlier, 43 of the cards in this deck are artifacts. Now, since Mystic Forge doesn't work with land cards, we can really only count 40 of those cards. Still, that's nearly half of our deck. So half of the time we'll be able to cast something from the top of our deck. The other half of the time, we can exile the top card using Mystic Forge's tap ability to see what's underneath. And if we have something to untap the Forge, We can use that tap ability multiple times in a single turn, further increasing the efficiency of this card. There have been many times in testing this deck where Mystic Forge can help us cast 2, 3, or maybe even 4 or more cards in a single turn. The other thing that makes this card even scarier is its combo potential. Mystic Forge combined with Sensei's Divining Top and any card that reduces the cost of artifact spells we cast allows for us to draw our entire deck. So let's say we have Ethereum Sculptor, Mystic Forge, and Sensei's Divining Top all on the battlefield. We tap the top to draw a card and put the top on top of our library. Mystic Forge allows us to play it off the top, and we can do this for 0 mana because of Ethereum Sculptor. So we cast top off the top of our library, then tap it again to draw a card and put it on top of our deck. We can do this until we've drawn our entire deck. This might not be as good as it seems though, because we don't have Laboratory Maniac or anything like that that allows us to win when we don't have any cards in our library. So if we do happen to run into this combo, we'll probably just be drawing as many cards as we want to until we run into something we really need at the time. Still, this is an extremely powerful combination of cards. Moving on, let's talk about the removal spells we're running in this deck. There are 10 cards in the deck that are able to remove permanents from the battlefield, which works out to just about 1 in every 10 cards we run into. I've discussed several of these cards already, but there are others that have yet to be mentioned. Pongify is one of the best blue removal spells in Commander. For just 1 blue mana, at instant speed we can remove a creature from the game. That opponent does get a 3/3 token, but we don't care because our creatures almost always have flying due to our commander's ability. Chaos Warp has become a commander staple for many red decks due to its versatility, instant speed, and low CMC. Oftentimes, creatures get in the way of Voltron strategies, but sometimes other permanents get in the way too. Effects such as Maze of Ith and Propaganda can hose our deck, so because of that, we need Chaos Warp to take care of those permanents. Next up is Cyclonic Rift. I really don't think this card needs to be explained. It's probably one of the best and most played cards in our format. The shift in tempo that it creates can often be enough to win games, particularly if you have a strong board state when you cast it. Blasphemous Act is another board wipe we're running in this deck. Aside from Rift, it's my opinion that this is the most reliable board wipe option in these colors. It costs 1 red and 8 other to cast, but also costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield, so oftentimes we're casting this at a significant discount. The last card I'll mention here is Oblivion Stone. I like this board wipe in this deck because it's an artifact, so our commander can help to cast it and activate the abilities on it. We can also use the first ability to protect our commander and other permanents from being destroyed once we are ready to activate the second ability. Now, I tend to think it's generally a good practice to not entirely rely on your commander to win you games. As a result, I've included this final category, which I like to call backup beaters. These are creatures that can come in handy if Dalakos becomes too expensive to cast or has been completely shut down in some other way. These creatures are big bodies that we can equip with our equipment to dole out some heavy damage. They do also synergize well with our commander in case we run into them when Dalakos is on the battlefield. First up is Steel Hellkite. I like this card because it can pump itself and remove threats from the battlefield. Also, 6 mana is perfect in this deck because if we play our commander on turn 3, we can play a 6-drop on turn 4 if we use Dalakos' mana ability. So we curve into this card perfectly. There are a couple of other artifact creatures at this sweet spot of 6 mana, Combustible Gearhulk and Wormcoil Engine. Combustible Gearhulk does have the potential to draw us cards, although most of the time our opponents will choose to risk taking damage over giving us cards. Wormcoil Engine is just a great card in general. Right off the bat, it's a 6/6 with Death Touch and Lifelink. Also, if it happens to die, we get 2 3/3 tokens out of it, one with Death Touch and one with Lifelink. Now, believe it or not, the last 2 backup beaters aren't technically creatures at all. Batterskull and Scytheclaw are technically equipment cards, but they have Living Weapon. So when they enter the battlefield, they create a 0/0 token and immediately attach themselves to that token. Batterskull becomes a 4/4 with Vigilance and Lifelink. And Scytheclaw becomes a 1/1, but when it deals damage to an opponent, that opponent loses half of their life total. Another great thing about these 2 beaters is if we cast them with Dalakos on the battlefield, they'll both also immediately have flying and haste. This is great with Batterskull, but even better with Scytheclaw. Can you imagine on turn 4 casting Scytheclaw with Dalakos and completely catching one of your opponents off guard? This thing can come out of nowhere and deal some serious damage. Now to finish out the deck list, let's quickly go over the land base. There are 37 lands in the deck in total. We'll start with the utility lands. Ancient Tomb will help us to ramp in the early turns and get our equipment out more quickly. Castle Vantress has a very good chance of entering untapped and provides card selection if we need it. Fiery Islet can tap for either of our colors, and then in the late game, we can sacrifice it to draw a card. Forgotten Cave and Lonely Sandbar both have cycling for 1 mana. We can play the land tapped if we really need to, or if we don't, we can cycle it to draw something else. Academy Ruins is an excellent utility land that will allow us to get an artifact card back from our graveyard. Next, we have a few lands that count as artifacts in Great Furnace, Seat of the Synod, and Darksteel Citadel. These cards help with effects like Mox Opal or Metalworker that care about the number of artifacts we have. Inventors Fair is another great utility land that we can pay for and sacrifice to tutor for an artifact as long as we control 3 or more artifacts. Rogue's Passage is another utility land that we can use to help get our commander damage through if our opponents happen to have a blocker that can block flying creatures. The last utility land is Wandering Fumarole. This unfortunately enters the battlefield tapped, but it taps for both of our colors, and we can turn it into a 1/4 or a 4/1 until end of turn, so we can use it as a blocker or a beater if we need either of those things. Moving on to the normal lands here, Command Tower, City of Brass, Steam Vents, and Cascade Bluffs all enter untapped and can produce either of our colors. Exotic Orchard has the potential to tap for blue or red, but relies on the colors our opponents are running. Still, with limited options for dual lands that enter untapped, this is a good inclusion. Sheevan Reef and Spire of Industry both tap for colorless or tap for one of either of our colors at the additional cost of reducing our life total by 1. Spire Bluff Canal and Sulphur Falls are both great options as well in these colors. And finally, for the basic lands, we're running 11 islands and 5 mountains. Now let's evaluate the power level of the deck. As always, we'll consider 5 factors: speed, synergy, board control, resilience, and consistency. This deck is relatively fast, so I'll give it an 8 in the speed category. What makes this deck fast is the fact that we have built-in ramp and haste enabling with our commander. We're often going to have a good start by turn 3 or 4 due to this. For synergy, I'm giving this deck an 8.5. Almost every card in this deck is either an equipment card, an artifact, or, in the case of our commander, something that cares about artifacts and/or equipment. Another great thing about the synergy of this deck is that, although it doesn't work as well, the cards still interact with each other when our commander is not on the battlefield. While fast and interactive, this deck does have an issue with board control. I gave this category a 6.5. A lot of our removal is built into our equipment, so we have to rely on our equipped creatures being able to attack or deal damage with these pieces of equipment attached. If we can consistently do this, then we're able to control the board. But the fact that we rely on this does hurt our ability to do so. Resilience is up next, and unfortunately this is not one of the deck's strong suits. I gave the deck a 5.5 in this category. One issue with Voltron is that just one board wipe can be incredibly devastating to the strategy, and rebuilding afterwards can be very difficult. Also with this strategy, you can only ever take out one opponent at a time, rather than all 3 opponents at once. Because of this, it takes longer to get a win and gives your surviving opponents more time to respond to what you're doing. Finally, I rated this deck's consistency at an 8.5. This deck is actually very consistent, and a lot of this again has to do with the fact that our commander is built-in ramp for the deck. A lot of consistency issues arise when you have an opening hand without ramp. This will never happen in this deck. Our deck of course also revolves around equipment, and the 99 cards in this deck are chock full of equipment, so it's rare that we have trouble running into those. In averaging these scores out, we get an overall power level for the deck of 7.4. And now that we're through with the all-out version, it's time for the budget breakdown. This is where we go over some changes to the deck that will help lower the cost. Starting with the equipment cards that pump our commander, Golem Skin Gauntlets can come in for Bloodforged Battle Axe. Inquisitor's Flail is another option for Double Strike that we can swap in for Embercleave. Hammer of Nazan will need to be swapped out, and instead we'll put in Grafted War Gear. This is another equipment card that doesn't cost anything to equip, so it can give something haste without any mana investment. Most of the sword cards are way up there in price and will need to be taken out as well. Sword of Vengeance can go in for Sword of Feast and Famine. Sword of Vengeance is good because in addition to the power boost, it gives Dalakos Vigilance, meaning we can use his tap ability after attacking in our post-combat main phase. For Sword of Fire and Ice, we'll put in Mechanized Production. This card, in its own way, gives us a card each turn by copying one of our equipment cards that we already control. Instead of Sword of War and Peace, we'll add in another equipment card that can protect our commander. Ring of Evos Isle will continue to make Dalakos bigger as long as it's on the battlefield, and we can pay 2 to give him hexproof for a turn. Umezawa's Jitta is another one of those real expensive equipment cards. Sai of the Shinobi is not a bad option for an equipment card in this deck. It costs 1 mana, gives Dalakos +1/+1, and equips automatically when he enters the battlefield, immediately giving him haste and flying thanks to his ability. The last card that we're taking out from this category is Champion's Helm. Nurok's Stealth Suit is a good budget option for protecting our commander. It gives Dalakos Shroud and can even be equipped at instant speed for 2 blue mana. Moving on to the ramp category, Cloud Key and its roughly $20 price tag will need to be removed. Talisman of Creativity is a fine enough budget option for ramp. Mox Opal can be nearly $60 to $80 depending on the printing. Mind Stone will work just fine as a 2-mana rock that can draw us a card in the late game. A good replacement for Sword of the Animist is Explorer's Scope. 1000 Year Elixir is almost $10. For that, let's put in Stormrider Rig, which also has the potential to give our commander haste since it automatically equips itself. Of course, with any budget deck, sacrifices will have to be made as some cards that are perfect for our strategy will be just too expensive. That's the case with Metalworker, unfortunately. A good replacement might be Burnished Heart, as it is the same CMC and serves the same function. Also, with Dalakos at the helm of this deck, playing him on turn 3 will give us 6 mana on turn 4, so we'll be able to cast it and activate Burnished Heart in the same turn. Unfortunately, Urza is too expensive to have in the budget list as well. Jwara's Familiar comes at the same CMC and will reduce the cost of our historic spells, which in this deck is mainly going to be our artifacts. In the card advantage category, Rhystic Study will need to come out. A great replacement for this is Thopter Spy Network. This 4 CMC enchantment will create us a 1/1 flying Thopter token at our upkeep as long as we control an artifact. Then, if we're able to deal combat damage with 1 or more of those Thopters, this enchantment is going to draw us a card. For removal, Cyclonic Rift is certainly not a budget commander card. River's Rebuke can have very close to the same effect, and this card only costs about $1. Finally, for our backup beaters, Batterskull is a great card, but it's expensive. Bone Horde has the potential to be a very large creature and is a good replacement. Wormcoil Engine will need to come out too. Hellkite Tyrant isn't an artifact creature, so Dalakos can't help cast it, but it does act as a great backup win condition, or at the very least, allows us to steal our opponent's artifacts to hinder them and further help us with our game plan. Now these are just a few of the changes you can make to lower the cost of the deck. If you'd like to see the full budget deck list, make sure you take a look at the link in the description of this video. Well, that'll do it for this deck tech. Thank you for watching. Especially since this is a new commander, if you have any ideas about how to build this deck differently, or think I may have missed a card or two, let me know about it in the comments. I'd love to hear everyone's ideas about how to make this deck the best that it can be. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any new deck techs. Thanks for getting your fix with me today. Peace out, guys.